Now, today we're talking about a very critical concept when it comes to food plotting, and this is something that I've been trying to hammer home for the last 15 years, but very, very critical. And it's something that can really make or break your small parcel when it comes to food plotting and attracting deer to your land and making sure that those deer stay on your land where you want them to all season long. Now, so important. If you look at this chart right here, just an example, it could be 40 acres, it could be 160 acres. You see these food plots right here, they have to be the same. And that's the concept. And what I mean by that is whatever combination that you're planting, that combination should be in each food plot. When I go to a lot of client properties, see, this is in clover, this is in brassica, this is in corn. That's a very, very bad thing. You have to have diversity, and we'll talk about that. Something I've been planting rotations, and I first started planting clover and brassica, for example, back in the late 90s, 98, 99, before anybody else that I even knew of was actually combining those two and trying to do that so that I was not just providing one forage for one certain time of the year and then the deer leave. We wanted to have that diversity. So we'll talk about that. You can have that all in one plot. You don't have to spread it out into all these plots. What happens is when you have a different planting in each plot, these red areas I look at as doe bedding. They want to be close to that food plot. And I talk about that in my layering concept where you have food, does, and then bucks. You have to make room. These blue areas are buck bedding, potential buck bedding. So if you have quality food plots, those food plots are screened, and then you provide the opportunity for doe bedding next door. This could be that you're creating hinge cuts on your land if they're appropriate, and they're appropriate on 20-25% of all lands. Maybe you're completing timber harvest. Maybe you're planting switchgrass pockets. You're cleaning out areas of autumn olive, hollowing out areas of gray dogwood so deer can actually move around through those cuttings, through that type of habitat that they like to bed in. And if you do that right next to your food plots, then you're going to have doe opportunity and doe bedding. Now, let's say that this area is in brassica, this area is in clover, and this area is in corn. Well, what happens is these does that would typically relate to that one food source, if you kept it the same all season long, those dominant does, when the clover is peaking over here in attraction, then they're going to move over here. These does down here, they're going to move over there. In fact, the entire deer herd is going to start to focus on the plot that is peaking in attraction at the time, and that's a very bad thing. So instead of having a really nice low stress movement where does can feed on that food source every single afternoon, that third feeding of the day, they feed twice in their bedding hours, that third major dinner time feeding on a food plot right before dark on private land, obviously, maybe a big clear cut on public land. And then after dark, they're feeding twice. And you want those deer to be off the parcel somewhere. Your neighbor that's not managing their food plot hunting pressure well, your neighbor's ag fields, bait piles in certain areas of the upper Midwest, southern states, you want those to feature the deer after dark, but you have to control that daytime movement. And if you're skipping around from food plot to food plot, this one's clover, that one's brassica, that one's corn, then you're placing all those deer that are attracted to those areas on one side of your parcel, one corner of your parcel. And when you do that, you can't fit as many does and fawns on there because they're very territorial. They're fighting over those food plots. So that's one very bad thing. Two, imagine if you have these nice low stress movements, all the same food, deer consistently attracted to those all season long. Then you develop these little micro movements of bucks, these blue areas where bucks are bedded down here. They might go to that food plot, this food plot. You could have them bedded interior. But because you've positioned those does around those food plots, then you're packing those does in tight to the food, and then you're leaving space in your woods for bucks behind that location. So you can maximize not only the number of deer you can have on your property that relate to your food plots on a daily basis, but the number of bucks through all these micro movements. If the deer are going back and forth and they're fighting and they're territorial, then I see that you might have one buck relate to that entire movement instead of multiple bucks relating to small micro movements on the land. When you have food plots that are planted all the same around your property, then all your stands, all the bedding areas, all the deer travel routes, and all the enhancements of water holes and mock scrapes continue to work for you regardless of where they're at on the entire property because you have your whole property working for you. You don't just have one corner. And what happens is if all the deer are feeding in this location, there's lots of turmoil, there's lots of stress. Again, those mature bucks just stay away from the area. Now, what I've done and what I've taught for a long time is that you want the same diversity in each food plot. And what's great about that is if you did want to plant, I'm not saying this would be the best mix, could be on some properties where I go to, depends on the property, every food plot prescription is different. Could be that you have corn, brassica, and clover in that same food plot. So you have the corn up here, clover, and then brassica. You keep that same diversity in that same plot at all time. That way, the deer that relate to this movement, especially those does, they don't want to move. They don't want to move to another food plot. They don't want to move to another bedding area. They don't want to compete for food sources. So allow this to happen right here. Then plant the same mix in this food plot, the same mix in that food plot. You look at that triangle of food plot where you have the foundation of greens, then you have corn, and then sometimes if you have anything room left over and you need to build a deer herd, you're planting beans. But you have to fill that green base and then corn. So in this case, and what we're doing in Minnesota here, we're planting the base of greens and then the corn, and that's on all our plots. We're starting to introduce it to all of the plots this year. But you have to have that same mix because you don't want does to favor one food plot or the other. Very easy to plant that diversity. And what I like doing too is, let's say you're rotating corn, and then maybe you have a late planting of beans and peas, August 1st, that I recommend. Some of the mixes I've recommended in the past, you can just look up 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20 best food plot mix, and you can see which ones I've recommended. But let's say you have that. You have corn, then you have brassica, and then you have the bean, pea, late combo. So those are 3 portions of the food plot. And in the brassica, what I like to do is John Comp's mix, the Sweet Feast Brassica blend is 6 pounds per acre. I like to cut that in half down to 3 pounds, and then I'll add 7 to 8 pounds of tillage radish to make up for that half acre that I took out, and that puts a higher percentage of tillage radish into the soil. In the bean and pea side that I would plant at that same time around August 1st as a brassica, you can introduce 10 pounds of medium red clover into it. What's nice about that is the following year, you can plant your corn into the heavy tillage radish side, and then the bean and pea side on the other half. And the clover is improving the soil on one portion of the green. And then the tillage radish, what's great about it is it develops a rotting pocket of organic matter into the soil. It fills with water, it freezes, thaws, it lifts up the soil. And then when it does that, it helps you avoid compaction. You don't have to plow. And then it puts that rotting husk below the soil. The soil covers it up, and now you have a nitrogen pocket for corn the following year. So you can take corn on one portion, even half the plot, 25% bean and pea, 25% brassica, and then you're just flipping the greens to the corn side, corn following the greens, and the goodness you're putting back into the soil. So even with keeping that concentrated in one area, you can always rotate those within the same plot, and now you can actually improve the soil health. So that's a good thing too, instead of rotating on a large basis where you're putting clover or corn or brassica in different food plots, put it all in the same. Now all your stands are working for you. All the bedding areas are working for you when it comes to does, and then buck bed layering, and then all the travel routes to the food sources and back in between bedding areas, and then all your enhancements of water holes, mock scrapes. Kind of imagine if they're all hitting this area of the property, then your stands over here aren't going to do very well. And that's why ag is bad when it comes to deer hunting as far as ag on your own lane. Ag on your neighbor's lane is always awesome because then the deer have some place to go at night. You're putting them out in those fields for feedings 4 and 5, taking them off your property. You're not spending your resources, and then they're coming back onto your land during the daylight. Controlling the daylight movement of 200 to 400 yards on average, where a mature buck will travel, is the number one strategy that you can have with any form of deer management on private land. But when it comes to smaller parcels, it doesn't matter if it's 500 acres or 5 acres, you have to have food sources that feature the same level of diversity everywhere, not separated food sources. That's a big no-no when it comes to providing not only great nutrition, great diversity, but building a great hunt. Because if these deer are always moving for the food plot of the moment, you have stands that aren't going to be working for you. You have deer bedding areas that aren't being used, travel routes that aren't being used, and then you have mock scrapes and water holes that aren't going to be used. And that's a waste of your property. And instead, you want your property working for you all season long. And when you do that, great things will happen. You can do that. You can still have all season diversity. You can still have great rotations for the soil health. And in the end, you're going to have a better property. You have a better ability to be the actual herd influencer in the neighborhood. You can actually attract the attention of multiple mature bucks on a small parcel because you have individual feeding lines of movement from bedding to feeding and then off your property, hopefully after dark. But bottom line is though, you have to separate your food plots, keep everything the same in each food plot, and you'll be on the track. You'll be on track for success this fall with not only your food plots, but then of course your ability to create a quality herd. And if you have a quality herd, you're going to have a quality hunt. You can't have one without the other. Good luck this food plot season, and make sure you follow this critical advice and critical concept for food plotting, because if you do that, then you're on track to providing the best parcel and building the best parcel that you can for this fall. Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.